Hi, my name is Andy Kirk, and welcome to Season 1 of Explore Explain. This is a podcast and video series all about data visualization design. In each episode, I have conversations with designers and developers to explore in depth the hidden thinking behind their visualization projects. I'll be asking them to explain the what, the why, and the how of their design process. We have some great guests, some wonderful projects to learn about, so let's jump straight into today's episode.
Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Explore Explain. My name's Andy Kirk and it's a great pleasure to meet for episode number 1, Anna Wiedeke. Anna, hi, how are you doing? Good to see you again. Can you just, for the listeners and viewers, give a brief introduction, please?
Hello. Excellent pronunciation of the last name, by the way.
Good start.
And I'm a senior visual journalist at 538. 538, for anybody who doesn't know, is a data-driven news site where we focus mostly on politics and sports and economics, and this year, of course, the coronavirus. What I do is I design charts and visualizations, as well as write text and code for the site, along with a bunch of other people on the interactives teams.
Super. Well, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you ever so much for giving up your time in what is, let's face it, a busy week. And I think it's worth mentioning
It's true.
a bit of a timestamp. This is Tuesday, the 27th of October, a week before the elections. And we're going to talk about a project that you've worked heavily on, which is the flagship 538 election forecast. For those who cannot see this project, can you give a brief synopsis of what this is, what its role is?
Sure, yeah. For those who don't know, 538, like you said, the flagship project is the forecast. Nate Silver usually makes a forecast every year, or does make a forecast for the midterms and for the presidential, House, Senate, and governor elections every election year. And the forecast is basically a website that visualizes the data that comes from that model. For very, very layman terms, it's a website with a lot of charts and tables and polls that help readers understand the probability based on our model of a candidate or a specific party winning a specific race that they're interested in.
Right, and it's for someone who's an outsider to this situation, it certainly feels like it is the main go-to place. I mean, there are plenty of news media organisations tracking the elections inevitably, but this feels like it is established as the sort of number one resource for this kind of content. And I guess it's an interesting context because it isn't a surprise that the elections come round. It's scheduled. You kind of know when this is happening, in contrast to sort of a breaking news story or things like that. And so just sort of think about the origin, because this isn't something that you kind of just come up with one day, let's do an election tracker, it's part and parcel of the day job. But in the sense of, let's say, 2020, when will the conversations begin about preparing for this, even if it's all the way away in November? What are the sort of initial sort of starting points that trigger working on this?
I mean, yeah, the forecast is not something we just stop talking about in a non-election year. I interviewed for this job last year in, I think, June. And it's one of the things that Chris, my boss, even said to me. He's like, you're going to be working on the forecast. And in my mind, I'm sitting in Switzerland. I'm like, okay, I guess you're right. True, election. I forgot how much of a thing an election year is a little bit in America. So I knew this would be a huge part of what I'm working on. So there were, obviously with the onset of coronavirus, we had a large part of like our jobs at that time in March was doing the coverage on that. But we were able to, when I speak we, mostly just the interactives teams, the other visual journalists as well as computational journalists. We were able to do some stories on the COVID trackers and this sort of thing, but almost at the end of March, at the beginning of April, we were already doing the project management and schedule organizing to take people out of some other projects and put them largely on the forecast. So I would say Chris and I's work started very early in April. And then with the onset of the design phase, more people got involved, and then the implementation phase. And then, of course, our stakeholders were involved basically throughout the 4 or 5, 6 months that it took to produce the piece.
Right, of course, yeah. And I guess the context of this year as well, as you say, with the outbreak, people working apart from each other, you're not in the same building anymore. And I guess there may be some benefits from that, just in terms of being able to kind of focus, but also, as we'll come on to shortly, the fact that there's a huge cast and crew of people who have an involvement in different elements of this project. So you mentioned Chris's involvement as well. Would it be fair to say that Chris is the kind of overseer, the kind of organizer, the project manager, coordinating the development?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've only heard stories about how the forecasts were done in previous election years, but I think this year, like having Chris largely on the project management was new for 538. To have like a central person who was keeping track of every single ticket and every single step in the process, as well as a design phase, a very specific design phase where we were all working with like static mocks and doing constant critique and feedback. Those two things were new parts of what we wanted to do for the forecast this year, largely I think because of my joining 538 as well as Chris's joining 538 last year. So I think that was another reason that maybe we started a little bit earlier than perhaps normal. But as I mentioned before, for all the other reasons, remote work, coronavirus, how hard it is to build a model with all of the things that are going on in 2020, which we can talk about later. It was really good that we got started as early as we did.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine that. And again, just before we get into some of the more sort of practical details of the context of the work, I think it's it's worth thinking about the context of where 538's forecast is in the kind of ancestry of both models and visualizations that have sort of displayed the models. To what degree is 538 trying to almost compete with itself from previous cycles and do better, do different? And how much is it a fact that it has to sort of carve out a certain uniqueness compared to other newsrooms? As we said before, everyone's going to be tracking this. So there is a pressure to sort of almost maintain that position as the go-to place, I guess. So to what degree does that kind of almost external pressure feed into the conversations that you have at the start of this process back in April time?
Yeah. That's a multi-layered question, of course. Like, to what extent do we deal with the bullshit of 2016, and to what extent, like, does our craft as visualizing a model that's built in-house, to what extent do we look at ourselves in comparison to competition? Let's say, like the horse in the room, the elephant in the room. The Economist came out with their forecast, and they came out with it many months before us. I'm sure for a number of reasons, but. Yeah, honestly, I thought about this question a lot, and I thought that 538, we do look at like the competition, and I think we are very different, both like structurally set up as well as like financially set up, as in comparison to other newsrooms. We also don't have a print product, just like a lot of things that make us very different than other newsrooms, and I think maybe that leads us to not really look too far and think, okay, how will our forecast, like why does the Economist forecast look like this, or why does the New York Times Needle look like this, and where's like the Venn diagram of where we overlap with the work that the Post does, or the LA Times, or Financial Times, or all of these other like really great organizations. And I think honestly, I must say, like I personally didn't in designing the forecast and implementing the forecast, spend a lot of time thinking about how we have an edge over other newsrooms. People come to 538 for a very specific reason throughout all of our coverage in any year, and people come to 538 for also a very, very, very specific reason during election year. And I think we have a readership that's very engaged and intense in the work that we do. So we want to produce the best product that we feel the most confident in publishing, and we want to be as transparent as possible with that product and the coverage around it, and not look too hard at what other people are producing. That's kind of how I would answer that.
No, I think that's right, and I think there's something perhaps about, as you said, it's whatever is needed to make this the best thing it is, and whether that involves reflecting on 4 years ago and changing some of the models underlying it, but also some of the visuals, some of the language, some of the ways of, as we'll come on to later, kind of communicating probabilities. I think you can get caught up too much with what others are doing, and I think there's enough talent in house for you to just sort of say, well, we'll do what we need to do, and then we'll see how that lands with the audience. And I guess from your point of view, arriving into the team sort of this calendar year, I wonder if there's a certain sort of freshness that you bring, and you don't bring perhaps the baggage, for want of a better term, from 4 years ago. You can bring a new insight, and also, you are somebody who's worked in newsrooms before now, so you understand the machinery of how all this works. So did you feel that there was a sense that it's a bit of almost like a playground for you? You've got this wonderful sort of flagship project to work on.
Yes, a blessing and a curse, and they're like in the best sense. It's great. We already had the debriefing about the project, so I can say whatever I want now. Like I said, I knew when I came to work at 538 that this would be a project that we were working on. Did I know it would take the entire year and largely like what I can say I've done for myself as a designer at the end of the year or as a visual journalist? No, I didn't know that it was going to consume all my time and require a lot of other skills outside of design and data visualization, honestly, like communication,
right.
Leading critique and feedback, dealing with stakeholders, like how to handle a no, even when I think maybe a yes would have been the right answer from from an expertise perspective or something like that. So I grew a lot as a designer coming into the team on that. I would love to think that I was able to bring a new skill set to 538, new skills to 538. I mentioned this before. Chris was also hired last year, and I think, my experience in leading a design team in a newsroom prior to this job was helpful in a lot of ways, as is Chris's experience managing a team. So I think those two things really did help make this get this thing off to the races eventually. But yeah, I don't know. You'd have to ask other people at 538 if the skills that I brought were welcomed. I think in a lot of senses it was an abrupt change, perhaps, for how things were done in the past. 538 is a small newsroom that is very dynamic and makes a lot of choices and quick decisions with very, very, very knowledgeable people and a lot of really amazing skills. But this time we kind of did things a lot more structured and a lot more with an established process in mind.
Yeah.
And I think you see a result to that, but you also might have had a lot of uncomfortable situations during the process just because it was new for people. And we were all learning to work together for the first time in a lot of ways. The two other visual journalists that largely worked on this project with me, Ryan and Jasmine, are also new to the team this year.
Right. And I think that, just to sort of move the conversation on to the the creative team, the people involved. I mentioned before that when you visit the page and you get down to the bottom, the kind of cast and crew, it's almost like watching the end of Lord of the Rings. You have to spend it just watching all these names come through. So I think it's fascinating that you mentioned there about the kind of conversations and the importance of communication and critique and critical evaluation. And you often may get those kind of conversations going with quite external people, like clients or people you are serving that are, to a degree, arm's length from your day-to-day involvement. But this is people you are working day in, day out with. So do you find that there's a need to almost develop a bit of a thick skin because you just don't have time to sugarcoat this sort of feedback? It's a case of we need to go forward with this. And although you might be quite invested in an idea that you've come up with and quite precious towards that, and we all are, do you think that was something that you learned quite quickly to just take the blows, move on, dust yourself off?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I can answer that from a lot of different ways. I guess I would say the kill your darlings discussion that you usually hear about in these sorts of critiques are areas where there's a lot of design feedback happening. I don't think a lot of them were that hard to do. And I don't think anybody walked away really upset about axing a chart or axing an annotation they thought looked cool, but is not the style of the overall piece or something like that. I don't think anybody really had that, because we also everything that was designed, we had to implement ourselves. It wasn't one of those situations that you find where you get to design whatever you want and give it to the implementation team. So we knew, we knew every choice that we made along the way, we would have to like deal with in order to bring it to production. So I think we were very smart about a lot of the decisions we made, and could talk through all of them. And as I said before, every single person who works on our team brings a very specific skill set. I'm blown away at the knowledge of the people that I work with. So we have a certain level of respect for each other that I think, even in this phase of getting to know each other and learning to work together, was there, which is often not the case when you're entering a new team. The one other thing I would say is that what people maybe not know, because they don't think about it, is that this is one, if not the only project that this many people at 538 work on, which is one of the reasons why there's a huge credit box at the end. We as an interactive team almost never work together in that capacity. So that adds yet another layer of, we respect each other as all individual journalists, because we all are, and we can all produce our own individual pieces on the site. But the challenge to bring all of that together plus stakeholders is one that we never really get, or I assume we never really get to practice, because we do it once every 4 or 2 years.
Right.
So
that's interesting. And in the same realm of discussion with regards to people, like, you touched on before, the audience, the readership. And I guess it's probably quite unique in this case, because you have got your hardcore 538 visitors who are there for every bit of content, irrespective of the topic. But then again, you've got this huge open world of people now kind of come into it, whether they are people in the US or people over here in the UK, kind of concerned with what the situation is. So is it possible to design for an audience in that case? Or do you almost just have to sort of rely on your own instincts of, what's the established base audience that we always feed, and everyone else who comes along has to sort of slip into their kind of alignment? What's the the discussions that you have about that?
I don't want to get myself in trouble. I think there are definitely split opinions in 538 as a whole of like who we're writing for, and should we expand our readership, and if we expand our readership, in what direction should we work hard to do that. There are also lots of people on the internet who have opinions about who we should write for and write to, and I understand that. And we are a media organization. We are allowed to have, or people are allowed to have opinions about the work that we do. So I respect all those things. I think I can say from my perspective, I came from a newsroom where we designed for the widest possible readership at the NZZ in Switzerland. And we also worked for subscriptions, which is something that 538 doesn't, right at the moment, doesn't have to do. So I think that allows us to really focus on this hardcore audience who has set the election forecast as their homepage, who has it auto-refreshing, who writes us emails every day to understand the polls, who, if they see typos in our work, immediately write us an email, or write someone who knows us, which is an experience I did not have before.
Right.
So there are definitely two ways to engage with your audience. One, you make the most general and friendly design to approach, or experience to approach. And I think, honestly, from my perspective, very, very truly as a designer in my craft, I believe that is a good way to approach things, especially when you visualize for the news. But learning a whole different way to see that at 538 with a very stats-friendly, numbers-friendly, chart-friendly audience. It's not just I love bar charts, but it's show me a histogram. And don't put any annotations on it, because I'm offended that you think I wouldn't understand it. So that is a different level. It is both irritating and wonderful at the same time. But I think there is, for me, very personally, I speak from my perspective, I do have that sense that I hope I don't lose the desire to speak to a broader audience, because I want to show my mom my work, and I want my mom to understand what I've done, right? I don't want her to see this polling database and be like, why would I even look at this? It's too complicated.
Right.
whether it's like putting one more annotation on the page or which we can talk about later, like forming the forecast more as a narrative, whether it's putting a fox on it that says, yo, I'm here to like help you out. There are small ways that we can do that, and it's what we tried to do with the forecast. Let's not insult the readership that is just like on fire for 538 and what we produce, and for different people who write for us, but also like maybe even show them a little bit more than they thought they knew by, you know, pulling back the curtain a little bit more for other readers who are politics curious or election curious. So I think that'll lead us farther into the future. But it is definitely, not everybody is ready to be like, okay, let's make this more general, which I understand.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because you're right, that there is, I guess from the outside, there's a sense that the typical 538 visitor is, you know, it's very sort of spreadsheet savvy. They're very much looking for the workings. They want to see the methodology. They want to, as you say, write in to say there's been a typo there and there. But also you've got the audience that are just looking for the banner page, saying in language terms what the situation is, and then that's probably it. I do recall, I don't remember if it was for the midterms possibly, which was the approach where you had the sort of different burger menus, the sort of again a hamburger quarter pounder and then the Big Mac, which felt like it was a way to try to partition the levels of detail for the different audience types. I think that's quite an interesting approach at that point. And we'll come on to the design contents shortly. Just a couple more points about the sort of context. The classic tension is always mobile, desktop, and how you design to feed both these beasts. And I don't expect any hidden insights into your Google Analytics reports, but I guess there's an entry point on both sides. As you said, the sort of purists might have this as a desktop homepage. There's also a lot of casual passers-by just bouncing off a Twitter link. The way that it's been designed is very kind of modular, which I guess makes it adaptable, flexible for this. But I mean, I guess in simple terms, is the desktop version seen as the best version, or is the mobile version seen as the best? Which is the one that you, I guess, primarily lean towards as the optimum version?
Yeah, I mean, I guess again, it depends on who you ask. If you ask my mom, she might be happy with the mobile version because she doesn't need the complexity that the desktop allows, right? But no, like, again, as a designer, I think one of my, I'm going to use the word failure just because it's easy, but I guess you could be more nuanced about what it is. I think one of my biggest failures is that we ended up really running short on time to make some of the maps on the congressional forecasts optimized for desktop, or sorry, for mobile. So we have, like, for the presidential forecast, which is the most important forecast, or the one that's most looked at, let's say, from a general audience perspective, that one is fully modular and is available on mobile and like all the best ways that we were able to do it. The other congressional forecast, because of the phases in which we had to design and develop, they had a less lead time. And so a lot of the stuff that we were able to come up with in the conception and design phase weren't able to be fully optimized for mobile. And then that's another choice, right? Do you put it on there anyway and people will zoom around and scroll and stuff? Or do you just take it away, which is also a curation choice. So I'm proud that we were able to make very conscious choices about what we were adding and how they looked. That's the best part of the design phase from my perspective in terms of optimizing for different devices. But yes, I do. That's like a sore spot for me that we weren't able to really come up with a great experience no matter what device you're looking at it on. But again, like I said before, or like maybe I hinted to this to you, I don't think I can give exact numbers, but I can tell you that 538 has an absolutely overwhelming desktop audience, which is
quite surprising.
Because I come from a newsroom where it was like you're crazy if you're not optimizing for mobile. People only they don't want the print anymore, and they don't really like access your content on desktop. They're scrolling on Twitter, they're doing it on their commute. What's a commute anymore? But you know what I'm saying? Like, but it's, again, 538 is just, it was so much new news, literally, to me, to to have such an engaged audience and to be optimizing for bigger screens. But that's the case.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I guess just the final point, couple of points. You talked about timing there and the kind of perhaps the rush to get the kind of congressional side and the senatorial side done. What was the reasoning behind the launch date, which I think, if correct me if I'm wrong, was the 12th of August, 13th of August? What was that milestone moment for, or was it just, it's ready, let's launch it?
Yeah. Man, I wish there was like I wish I had come up with a good reason for this. I hope I don't get in trouble, Chris. Sorry. No, I mean, we plan to have it launched a couple of months before that. Right. To be honest, I think, again, I know from a spoiled vacation I took this year, you can't plan anything in 2020 and have it happen. So we should have just started in November and planned for an April launch, and then we would have gotten to where we actually needed to be. But no, I mean, 538 made a very conscious decision early on in the year, which was the right decision, to cover a lot of COVID-related news that was coming out. How that's, of course, like with a political focus, because that's our bread and butter, right? And with a sports focus, of course, because that also affected sports for us, which is a huge part of our readership. So we definitely shifted gears, and I think, which means Nate shifted gears, and Nate is, the biggest part of making the model, which drives the forecast for us. And so I think that had a lot to do with the lead time. We had a lot of lead time. We had a lot of time to like optimize things in the design phase, but to the point where we actually got the data. And then, of course, as every person who works in our industry knows, once you get the real data, that's when you have to go back to the design phase and go back to the implementation phase, because hopefully you've optimized for weird data, but you haven't optimized for the exact thing that you get at the end. And even though we've done forecasts before, you still get crazy shit happening in your charts that you need to make sure people understand and can read. So I think to answer very specifically about the congressional stuff, it just meant that we had a shorter design phase and therefore a shorter implementation phase. And we worked on a smaller team. It was just myself and one of our computational journalists, Aaron, who did the design for the congressional work, which was awesome. But again, like cuts your capacity down. And so basically when you saw the launch, that's when we were ready.
Right. Got you. But I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, I guess there is probably some science behind the point at which this is most going to reach an appetite of audience to show this stuff. I mean, if you go too early, probably not as relevant. If you go too late, well, everyone kind of knows where it's going. So I think it's one thing planning for that, but then just the reality of delivery is a clear, as you said, this year is a complete other thing completely. You talked about data. I think it's worth moving on now to sort of the content. Now, I'm not going to, in this episode, try and get into the weeds and the nuances of the models, because I mean, this is like asking how's Coca-Cola produced, because it's not only is it going to be a secret sauce, it's also just incredibly complicated and sophisticated. But and just to also mention, we're going to focus really on the presidential element of the site. In a nutshell, could you just sort of speak to what is the data that we see on the site? What's driving? What's ultimately the first thing that we encounter, which is essentially who's going to win and what degree of likelihood is that going to happen? What is the data that is underneath that singular headline that we see?
Mm-hmm. I think this is definitely spelled out for you in the methodology, but since we are maybe not talking to this user at the moment, it's definitely largely our forecast runs on polling, which everyone has an opinion about in the political visualization world. But you're seeing polling and priors. So I'll keep it very basic, right? So like what do the state polls say, state by state, who's going to win, or like who is favored in what state by likely voters, or by registered voters, likely voters. And then you also have national polling, which both are two pages that are high trafficked on the 538 site. Our readers are also constantly looking at the polls. So that's driving all of that is polling averages. And all of that goes into the model, as well as a bunch of data points and priors that we know. So we don't have a ton of data points. We're a young country for how elections shook out in past years. But we do have some, and we do have some information about how the economy affects an election, how incumbents affects an election, a bunch of things. One we don't have necessarily is how COVID affects an election, how pandemic affects an election. I mean, we know some things about certain moods of a country, but we don't know a whole lot. And so a lot of it is priors, how you weight those priors, and what the polls say state by state and on a national level. So that's kind of what you're looking at.
Interesting, yeah. So I guess I'd probably, in my own thinking, I'd probably ignored the fact or neglected the fact that there are other data sources, as you said, about the economy and about other environmental factors that would also therefore, I guess, feed into the weighting. I guess the secret is probably the weighting, I guess, and how these different levers are pulled to shape that data. So now that's fascinating. And as you said, there are these unknown factors like COVID, like the possibilities of issues around the mailing of ballots and all these kind of things that I guess you can only speculate to a certain degree, beyond which that's just pure guessing, really. You spoke before, and it was perhaps more in the context of the kind of congressional data about, wild data points and things that just sort of trip things regarding, I don't know, scales and chart dimensions. At the state and the national presidential side of things, are there any just annoying data points? I mean, I picked out in my notes Maine and Nebraska, and I don't know too much about the nuances of these, but what are the data points that kind of internally you're thinking, oh, we've got to deal with that thing?
And these are the ones that you're like, it's not happening until it's happening when you're doing when you're designing. I would say there's a couple of things. Of course, you have some states that have they have an at large, and then they have districts. So you have Maine and Nebraska with these districts and at large states statewide, and those are kind of annoying, but honestly not in terms of R4. Either the design is incredible, or it just it's not like an annoying piece to deal with. You just have to add another page or make sure you have that shape file for the geography where you're going to show it. But I think independence, as much as I would personally love to see more political parties in our party system, it is, I designed or I worked in Switzerland before this, so designing for multiple parties is annoying, but great maybe in terms of how you want where you want to live. But here we have that benefit of only designing for two parties, so you only have to find two colors and you only have to have two candidate heads. So when there's a legitimate third party member running, you have to think about how that visualization might change.
Right.
So if you design something like our top line, which with all the dots, it doesn't really work super well for a third party candidate. It's a spectrum, whether it's popular vote share or electoral vote share, and I think that if you had to add a third head in there and had to have a third dimension in that chart, it doesn't really work well. So I think that was one thing we had to always keep open. Will there be will Kanye West run as an independent, or something, or somebody different, right?
Yeah.
So that was one thing. I'm trying to think of anything else that came up. There's a couple of just things, there's some jungle primaries, which has to do with where there's runoffs. You have two Democrats running and a Republican, or, as many as you want. So you're not just looking at two candidates for every chart, which again changes that dimensionality of how that chart needs to work. Different timed elections. So not all of it gets decided in November, depending with the runoffs, that can also be different. Right. And I think there was one more I had just in my mind. Obviously I think this is a little bit of a nuanced thing, but one thing we've run into is when a candidate dies. So we had one oh man, I'm trying to I'm trying to think of the state now. We affixed a footnote to it because it was a question of how to deal with it. If you have a candidate die, then there becomes a kind of a legal battle on whether the election should go on and when it should go on, and who's trying to steal what election. I mean, it gets pretty nasty in the sense of our political climate now. But that is also
Right.
a thing, like how do you handle it? And it's something we also thought about, speaking of what if one of the candidates dies, Biden or Trump, for example.
Yeah, of course.
What happens to the forecast?
Yeah.
So, which is like, seems terrible to ask, but it is a question that, it is the thing that people come to know how the election might turn out. And if as Trump got COVID, it was a question of how are we going to handle this on the forecast? How do we educate, our readership about how that might change? So.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, obviously, as you said, there are some of those things which are just knowable quirks and, challenges around the third party, for example. And then I guess there's just a bunch of what ifs that you have to just prepare for the eventuality. As you said, even if it's necessarily a kind of a morbid thing to consider, it is, in the context we are in this year, something that isn't the most unimaginable possible scenario. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the kind of contents that we see on the work itself, and starting with the national overview. So the very first thing that we see, which is, if we think about both the desktop experience and the mobile experience, it occupies whatever space is on your screen, really, and it's the headline, and it's the summary current model forecast of who is likely to win and to what degree, in language terms, is that possibly going to happen. But then surrounding it, we've got a bunch of, model scenarios, in the sense of these maps that, and correct me if I'm wrong, they highlight the states that they have won in the models. Now, again, on the desktop version, I'm seeing sort of 22, I think, maps, and on the mobile, I think there's about 6. What's the criteria for what we see? And does it change in each visit? In fact, I've not tried that out, but what do we see surrounding this headline?
We see what we nicely like to call the wall of maps, or I like to call it the wall of maps. It's definitely a thing that we developed to remind the reader that what we're talking about is electoral college wins, and we're talking about how the map shakes out, not popular vote and not vote share. So what can a Biden win look like, and what can a Trump win look like? And it doesn't look like a huge red map or a huge blue map. And I think that's really something we wanted to try to get at a little bit subtly, which is funny because we're talking about 22 maps on a desktop screen, but it comes back to look, we're looking at an entire nation and how those states lean in any direction. And you can kind of see that the Trump wins, the one I'm looking at right now, the Trump wins look fairly the same, but Biden wins can look very differently or in this case, at this moment, when I'm looking at the forecast, looks very differently. And it isn't just coastal states. So that tells you a little bit more about the data that we're working with this year, and a little bit more about how states are leaning this year as opposed to perhaps previous years. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and I get one of the first occasions that I visited the site. Actually, I almost missed seeing them. Part of it almost felt quite decorative, and I guess it's not necessarily something that's explicitly obvious that it is a bunch of different models that feed this line that we see there. But I think it straddles both those features, which I think is quite nice, because then you come back to it and you think, oh, hang on, how have I just missed these 22 maps that are actually supporting the thing that we see there? So no, I think it works quite well, and obviously, and I'll link this in the posting of the episode. You've done a great article to sort of talk about some of the other options that you've explored there. So, I'll share those details, and rather than go through again everything that you went through, but there's some nicely crazy things that you did explore, which was good to see. Moving down, actually, the next content is latest news, which I think is quite interesting. On the basis that nothing is done without some degree of deliberacy, what's the thinking there that this is the next thing that we can show rather than, let's say, a chart that supports the headline that we've seen at the top?
So I'll go ahead and reference that this is one of the choices that we made as a result, I think, or partially as a result of 2020 or 2016 and 2018. What we do at 538 is so much more than just the forecast. Even in an election year, we're producing tons of articles on our website written by really smart people. So to bring people to our coverage, because our coverage to a further extent explains what people are seeing in the forecast. So that's one thing. And the second thing is also, it's essentially the same. It's just really providing yet more context for people. Sometimes we even reference to other people's work, of course. This is just telling you what's the state of the race, but in terms if you're not trying to look at charts, but you're trying to understand from a plain language perspective what's going on, and where else you can find more information about why the numbers say what they say. But I think that was one thing that we missed a little bit, even though we produce so much work around the election. Our election coverage is very important. We didn't spend a lot of time encouraging readers to go seek that out more actively. Okay. And this time we can do that with this, big piece. There's probably some different feelings about how much writing needs to be here and how many links one needs to click on. But it is definitely a way to say, look, we are journalists, we are forming narrative for you. Here are the things that we think are important. Here are the other things that you should look at that you're not seeing on these top line numbers of who's going to win. So for example, one way, what's on there now is really great. It's Sarah wrote this, our politics editor, and she made a really great comparison. I think it says Trump has a meaningful chance of winning the election, which some people, again, might not think because they see Biden has an 88% chance of winning, or 88 and 100. So you might read that as landslide. But if you read this, you would see Trump still has a meaningful chance of winning the election. He has a chance of rolling, a 6 or a 1 on a 6-sided die. So 1 in 6 chance, which is about as, let me read this straight to you, which is about as likely as it rains in downtown LA. So that really is able to give that reader another way of looking at the numbers and in a real world sense, how to understand them. And I think that this little section kind of allows us to do a little bit more narrative, which is often our job as journalists.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that jump out there. First of all, the idea that possibly, I'm just picking up from what you're saying, is that the chart in the data content has perhaps at times been a little bit detached from the written content, which, as you say, is such a fundamental part of the output from the site. And so kind of bringing that into kind of an integrated solution, and also, as you said, putting this front and center before we even get to the charts, I think is quite an interesting approach. But also the language. I mean, I know that so much introspection after 2016 was about the language of expressing probabilities and possibilities. I know that the New York Times, I think, have experimented in the past with trying to equate it to things like, I'm going to shut my lack of knowledge about American football, but things like field goal possibilities from different distances. And I guess, you're always trying to, even though you are, again, going back to the audience, you are talking to a sophisticated audience. It's still hard for people to wrap their heads around. As you said, an 88% chance is not just a landslide. It's more likely than not to happen, but it's not an absolute certain thing. So that language, I think, is really important. As we move down the page, we'll then get into this, the sort of bunch of charts. And the first one is the sort of summary of 100 outcomes from the 40,000 simulations that you've run based on the current data. So, is it literally just 100 random selections from that 40,000 bunch of data points?
Yeah.
And this then feeds the top line that we see in the headline. Is that correct? How it all joins together?
Yes. Yeah. And if you hover over, if you're on the desktop, you can hover over each one of these little dots. So it looks kind of like a bee swarm chart. And it's distributed over electoral vote margin. So you have an equal. I'm trying to explain it for the readers who aren't looking at it. An equal scale on both sides, and 100 dots, and those dots are colored based on which candidate wins that one simulation or that one outcome. And if you hover over that, that is a direct connection to what the wall of maps that we talked about you're seeing at the very, very top of the page. It shows you how that election or that electoral map shook out. So I'm hovering over one right now, that's a Biden win, and I see that Biden won 358 electoral votes to Trump's 180. And I'm looking at what looks like a largely coastal blue state win with a Midwest red state win. So it really, again, links people back to, okay, this outcome is made up of a bunch of states that had to make choices, and then all of those states represent a certain number, and all of those numbers added up equals one of these candidates gets more than 270 electoral votes. So yeah,
and I think what's
there's a
interesting
lot
there is
of
that,
nuance into that chart.
Yeah, and I think that nuance is important. I think it does support the language of likelihoods that we talk about above. Just showing, there are, in my view, there's 12 dots on this side. So, these are the situations that we speak about that could happen. But I think also, this is jumping a little bit forward, but with regards to the annotations, it's quite light touch on that front with regards to, grid lines and axis labels. It's very much just how much over on that side is it and how much over on that side is it, which I think, to a certain degree, feels quite courageous to not feel the need to put all those decimal point details in, because you could read too much into that. This is just 100 sample from simulations. It's not perfect. It's not known knowledge. It's decent assumptions that have led to it. So I think that's a very useful sort of visual guide there. Just while we're in the neighborhood, we've got a couple of illustrations of Trump and Biden. Who did those?
They were done by, I'm going to scroll down so I don't get his name wrong. There's two illustrators that worked with us. The Fabio Bunocor, I think is his name. He did all of the candidate illustrations you've seen on the 538 pages from the Democratic primary to now. And then Joey Ellis, who is the brain behind 5e Fox, who is dancing around the page the entire time. So yeah, no, and Twitter and Reddit love to discuss which news outlet has the best candidate illustrations and why. So that's a whole nother subculture of illustrating American candidates. Yeah,
absolutely. Just moving down, so the next display is a sort of more smoothed, not histogram, but kind of a smoothed area chart. Actually, no, it's more of a bunch of bar charts, but with a smooth line to give you a sense of the trends, which then sort of declares the 40,000 on which the 100 previously were based. And again, although I think the B Swarm plot above was probably, thinking off the top of my head, the only choice that you could really use for that kind of display. Were there others that you considered for this particular chart?
For the every outcome in our simulations chart, the histogram. Yeah, no, this is like a really great way to show the data. Honestly, it shows you that noise as well. It is a histogram, 2 histograms. You're seeing a lot of bar noise in the background. And we loosely label that as those are the more likely more likely outcomes. And then we put that smooth rolling average on top to give you to basically allow you to skim this if you wanted to skim it.
Right.
So you can still get to those peaks where you see Trump. You have, if you look at the histogram, you have a pretty high peak around 120 electoral votes. And for Biden, the truth is these are just flipped versions of each other. Yeah. You could make one histogram out of this. One of the reasons why we didn't is because if you had a third party candidate, you'd have to have 3 different histograms because the data would be then different. But these are just the same histogram but flipped on the other side. So you can see the more likely outcome is that Trump has 120 electoral votes and Biden has just over 400. So
was there any version where there was a 40,000 dot B Swarm?
So there were there were a lot of versions for the top line. In 2016, if you look back at that, there's a bar chart, and that's the same. It's the same data. In 2018, we did a histogram for the top chart, which looks a lot like what these, the second part of this forecast, where it says every outcome in our simulations, that looked like that. And I referenced that in this article I wrote about what is the middle ground between these two things. And I would add to that, like, the bee swarm chart is, in a lot of ways, it's the middle ground. It's showing that complexity, but it's also keeping it, I would say, weird and simple, because it is weird. And it has those like weird candidate heads in the back, but I think in a lot of ways we use that as a way to like draw people in and be like, this looks a little strange. I might not understand it at first, but I'm interested enough to look and read those labels, and then I see, okay, if I back up from it, there are more blue dots and there are more red dots. And you could take that as your takeaway if you want. There's more information there, but that could be the takeaway. And it's still, from our perspective, at least from mine, better than a bar chart. It's still better. It still gives you a little more, as you said before, I still see those 12 dots that have Trump color. And I know that there are still 12 ways that he can win, like, for a very basic way to say that. And if you look at this histogram, which tells you a lot more information about how electoral votes can break down, and a lot more of a roller coaster that we could experience, which we might experience, which we have been experiencing, that's a way, it's already a much more nuanced way to look at this. And I think not everybody wants to look at it that way. And if people scrolled past this histogram, it would be all right. And so I think that kind of, if that gives you a sense of our thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something there as well. We didn't touch on it before, but there's, I guess, all these little modular assets operate as potentially social media bite-sized things to share out. The other thing that kind of struck me on the kind of histogram view is I was probably imagining that there were more discrete mathematics, in that there are only certain numerical combinations of electoral seats that you can win, but there actually does seem to be much more variety, through the different simulations. So I was actually expecting to see like lots of, I know there are already lots of peaks around sort of the most common combinations or permutations. But I was surprised to see that there is even more mathematical sort of variability than I might imagine. Moving down to the next piece, which I think is in my view, it's the centerpiece. It's
crowd favorite.
The crowd favorite, absolutely. I mean, you've left it until panel 5, but we got there eventually.
I know. I put it at the top, honestly. It's so great.
The snake chart is a survivor, I think, from memory, from 16, maybe even 12, possibly. I can't remember. And again, just to describe it, if you imagine a stats bar chart where it goes on a wild sort of snake route across the page at this sort of tilted angle. And I mean, I love it, and I loved it the first moment I saw it. And I think what I just love about it is it's not so much what's happening at each end, it's just when does the part of the body hit that key mark. It's what colour is the section of the body when you get there. And then obviously, as time moves on, these things change. I mean, clearly this is a survivor. Is it simply because it was so well received in previous occasions that you just couldn't afford to kill it?
I mean, no, I would say like one, I mean, yes and no. Like it is, it survives because it's one of the best ways to explain how our political system works. And it's also one of the best ways to see, from my perspective, without any numbers, what is what's going to happen and what states are really important. And so I think we were able to give this a little bit of 2.0. Hopefully I'm not disgracing Aaron, who was the brain behind, who did one of our computational journalists. He is the one who built the one in 2016, which was brilliant. There was no question in the design review of the past elections or the past forecast that this would make it into this forecast. No question. Love the snake chart. We wanted to make it a little bit more prominent, which is why it's giant. Or one of the reasons why it's giant. It also allows you to spend more time with it. That's just like normal. Make something bigger, it becomes more of a focal point. And we have one thing we have added is a nice hover, which you have on desktop. Actually, I think you can tap on each segment of the snake. The one thing that I would say, so it's one whole snake, which is all 50 states and the Nebraska and Maine districts, and they're color-coded by the likelihood Trump wins or the likelihood Biden wins. So blue, as you said before, are there more blue or are there more red? And if you see more blue, you could come away with thinking it's more likely that Biden wins. If that's all you take, great. The other thing you can take away from it is looking at the size of the segments. Size of the segments, how many electoral votes? So you could say all of the big ones are on Biden's side, or some of them are on Trump's side, or you can look again into that level of detail in the snake. And then, of course, you can look at the ordering, which is, double encoded with the color, that tells you DC is going to Biden for sure. And Nebraska third is definitely going to Trump. So you learn more nuances about the smaller states, or states maybe you didn't think about because they're not so obvious, like California, for example. And then it tells you again the tipping point state, which is that state that's the one that crosses the line. So is it Nebraska 2? Is it Arizona? Is it Wisconsin? Is it Pennsylvania? And that changes throughout the entire year, or whenever we put up the forecast. So I've watched several states go through, be the one that crosses the line, and then that helps explain what we call the tipping point state, which is the state that's most likely to bring that candidate across the line. And it does that in a very, very, very literal sense by having a line there and being the one that crosses it. So
we've got the interactive option then to sort of break this up to sort of almost editorially say, right, these are nailed on, but then these others are the ones that you should be paying attention to see how they swing through the process. And as we've said, the clickability on each state then takes you to the individual state page, if you like. Just moving down quite quickly, so we have got below that the navigation options to the US Senate and the House forecast, which is also at the top of the page on desktop to jump to. But then we've got how the forecast has changed. So this is again the underlying models, how they've shifted, and this once again feels like a really important chart, but one that could probably be misread by some people. So I think it's useful to have the sort of chance of winning, and then the electoral votes and the popular votes as interactive options to be able to flip between those. So you get the right language as a reader for what you're currently seeing. And I guess, I mean, there doesn't really feel like an alternative other than a line chart for those. It just feels like it's the classic, most obvious device, albeit for the electoral vote and popular vote, you've got the sort of margins of error, which again, I think is something some people struggle with conceptually to think about what that actually means. But then when you get the daylight emerging, I think that's when you feel a little bit of sense of, all right, so this is pretty likely to happen as an outcome. Just jump into the last section of this front page. We've got this sort of menu of unusual sundries, almost, of the weird and not so weird possibilities. I guess the simple question is, why is this on the main page? And secondly, what leads any one of these items to be included? Is it a result of the kind of FAQs that people keep prompting? What's the chance of this happening? How's that shaped?
Yeah, I mean, on launch, this wasn't on the page, but it's definitely something that we always knew we wanted to add. It's one of the things that I think is more accessible for people who are like, people coming from different states. Obviously, I live in New York City. It feels like it's a Biden place. It feels Democratic or independent in that sense. And my mom, she lives in Ohio. It feels very Trumpian. So, like, she might ask the question, like, I don't know, everything I'm seeing is Trump, so it feels like Trump's going to win. So what's the likelihood that Trump wins in a landslide?
Right.
And from my perspective, all my friends feel like very progressive. So is it more likely that Biden wins in a landslide? It's 88%, right? So it does help break down some of those very like statement like questions that you're asking in conversations at the pub, or not at the pub, but like social distancing with your friends on Zoom. If you're talking about the election, you might be asking about those sort of things. Especially if you were interested in 2016, you might say, okay, but what about this whole like thing where one of the candidates won the popular vote but not the electoral college? What was that all about? And then you can look on this chart, or on this this table rather, and see, okay, what's the likelihood that Biden wins a popular vote but loses the electoral college, which we know is what happened to Hillary last election. So you can see there's still an 8 out of 10 chance of that happening. So I think that helps answer some of these lower level questions, also kind of funny or interesting things. To some sense. So yeah.
No, I like that. And I think as we sort of move down, then you've got another sort of link to see the national poll details and to then visit the states with the closest races by default. And I think kind of collectively sort of taking a step back, it feels like it is both an informative overall page, but also a central repository to orientate you into other places, to take you elsewhere, to give you all this sort of menu of different content. And on that note, interactivity, the interactivity is fairly limited in the sense that you are largely focusing on sort of tooltips and hover events or selection controls to move people elsewhere, rather than quite deep exploratory interactivity where you can run things and manipulate things and do what if queries. And is that, I mean, it will be deliberate, but is there a temptation to go deeper and further by giving people tools to play around and to try what ifs? Or do you feel that it's more incumbent on you to be almost custodians of the information and let people just navigate to your content in a sense?
So 2 things. One, I mean, the forecast, as you mentioned, kind of at the top of this, it has the opportunity to meet a very broad audience. And if we unleash the model and all of its many craziness in terms of how deep you can go into it and how weird things could get if you push and pull at it, I don't think we're on board with doing something like that in the forecast, because the forecast should be this general piece. It should be something that our reporters can use to find information for their coverage. It should be something that and another level of readership can get to if they only come to 538 during an election year. So that's one thing, and that's also why we looked at doing a more narrative form and a less like, here's a bunch of charts, scroll through and figure out the most interesting thing you want to look at, which is what I would argue how some of our forecasts had looked in the past. It's funny you should ask that, though. We did just launch last week a choose your own adventure of the forecast. So you can go see that on our website. We did the exact same thing during the Democratic primaries, where we launched the primary forecast and then did a choose your own adventure. We call it paths to the nomination, and this year would be like paths to winning the election, where you can you get you get a US map, a bunch of buttons, and you can choose whether Biden wins Pennsylvania and Trump wins Wisconsin, Minnesota, and whatever else, and how those chances change. What you will see on that piece is a lot of the same visualization that you've seen in the forecast, which is great. It helps reinforce how to read that ball swarm, bee swarm chart at the top. And it allows you to really play around with what if Pennsylvania is the tipping point state, but I give it to Trump and not Biden. So what does that do to Biden's chances? Which again helps you learn more about how states add up and how changing one state for a specific candidate can tell you more information about the leanings of other states, right? Because we have similar geographies or similar demographics. So those states are not living on their own in a vacuum. Which is something that maybe people who don't live in the United States, or arguably even some people who live here, don't really know about how our system works.
That's interesting. And I guess that kind of choose your own adventure playability becomes probably more relevant now as we get to a point of fairly, not so much stable forecast, but the polling has done its job. It's now almost, as you loom towards election time, you almost want to sort of try these permutations out to see as the night develops or the morning develops, what could happen next. And okay, let's drag that over there. And all right, that's where it goes next. So I'm very aware of how busy you are, Anna. And so I'm just going to fire some quick things just to kind of close off the conversation. The red and the blue look like a different red and blue to the sort of entry-level, off-the-shelf democratic red and blue. Is that correct? Why these particular hues?
Great question. Yeah, so we have a wonderful art director, Emily, who had done a lot of work doing the branding around. So she's responsible for the 538 2020 logo you see at the top of the forecast. If you visit 538.com, you see a bunch of very cute illustrations for a lot of our teaser images. You see 5e Fox, you see a lot of other things that have her mark as an art director on it. And she was the one who did a lot of, the lead branding on this. So I took her two colors that she chose and then basically created these gradients and other like kind of sub hues off of her work there. And everything, I think you'll link to the article that I wrote about this piece. Everything is in a style guide that's publicly available, so anybody can go look and steal all the colors if you want.
And I guess just very quickly, that style guide is just helpful, I guess, especially when you're working, collaboratively. I imagine to take away the pain of having to think every time you reach a new color choice, what could this be? I guess it just gives you a sense of, right, I can just remove that noise and focus on the content or the build and just not worry about having to rethink this every time. And obviously, you've, I'm sure, experienced that before working for NZZ. And, I think for an organization like this, it's vital. I think some other places will do it with too much of a blunt instrument as a restrictive thing rather than an assistance thing. So that kind of stands out. And I think also you touched upon before the fact that in these other spin-off products, or indeed the state Senate races underneath this page, there's a consistency. There's a familiarity of the charting techniques and the layout and the annotation level of detail. So you kind of feel that the whole thing is just by the same people, which I think sometimes helps and isn't always the case. Last two things. We need to mention 5e Fox, because I've seen lots of twittering about this, and the inevitably there are two camps that fall down.
Yes.
What's the kind of background behind that little character?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna say what everybody already knows, and it's just true. 5e is just the better version of Clippy, honestly. So it's funny because I think many people on our team had thought about this and had not all discussed. We weren't all like, let's make a Clippy. I think I know specifically I was thinking about it. I know specifically Emily was thinking about it, and some other people on the team had thought, yeah, like what if we had like a little Nate or something, like some sort of thing that could help. I mean, I think it comes back to an original mock-up I had. I think I have a picture of it in this article that I wrote. I wanted to think about doing this kind of as a video game and a much more exploratory,
right,
but a guided exploration. And it was a little bit more ethereal, a little bit more abstract. But that mock led to this discussion of what if we actually did have a character, which that plus great art direction and working with great illustrators led to a lot of really amazing options. We ended up going with 5e, but there's a whole plethora of really great, rich options. And if you want a 5e Fox t-shirt, they're at 538's.
I was going to say there's a whole merch generated from this, yeah. And as you say, I guess in future years or midterms, there's going to be a repertoire of characters that will emerge, and they'll have cuddly toy versions, and yeah, that could be a very lucrative line to follow. Just a couple last things then. So, in a nutshell, I don't expect great details, but what would be the technology stack that feeds the device that we see here? Because everyone's always asking, how did you build this and that? So what are the main technologies used?
Yeah. So obviously the model is its own beast. I don't interact too much with it, but I know that Nate writes it with Stata. So that's that end. And then it goes to our amazing computational journalists, Jay and Aaron. They write Ruby code to make Stata play nice. And what we end up getting on the front end is CSVs, JSON files. And so obviously like all of the mocking and stuff is done from my perspective, or from my end, it was done in Sketch, can also be done in Illustrator. Those are the design tools that usually we use. In a next world, I would love to be in more of a collaborative design environment with like Figma and so on. just to speak to those design background data visualization designers. And then we end up writing all of our front end in like vanilla JavaScript D3 to play nicely with the JSON and CSV files, and so that's what you're looking at on the interactive page.
Cool, thank you. And then just to close, I guess with your reflections of your process going through this, what have you enjoyed? What's your favourite bit of the whole thing? Are there any little details that we've missed? You think I need to tell people about this because you won't believe the amount of struggle I went through to do that thing, or what can you reflect on now? Because you have talked about the team environment and the process that you've gone through, and how you've sort of said that this will enrich you as a professional. But are there any particular sort of headline highlights for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is the first, I can say this. This was the first project that I have designed and pushed interactive code to make a right. That's something that a lot of you always usually end up in this are you a unicorn camp or are you not, in the data visualization world. If you can't code, get out, or if you don't pick a side, then you're broad and not deep, or whatever, this sort of thing. And I struggled with that for a long time. And 538 really has, especially a project like the Forecast, you're doing all of it. So I think I learned a lot as a practitioner from that sense. When that is the case, you're also working with people who span the spectrum as well. And I think, like I said before, working with computational journalists, working with database journalists, which we have, as well as quant editors, those are the three jobs that exist at 538 that I didn't know existed, and they are incredible, and they have an amount of knowledge that is just blows my mind, and I'm very lucky to work with them. So I would say this project allows all of these people to be in the same place, as well as our politics editor. I got to work with Nate, which is its own really interesting and amazing experience. So you learn so much from Nate, Sarah, and Micah, who are big 538 names. I wanted to point this out earlier. It's a ridiculous small design thing that I would like to point out on the Forecast. If you see an outline of a state through a hover or in any of the modular boxes, the gradient on that state is actually the odds of either candidate winning that state.
I was going to ask that. I wondered.
Okay,
if it was.
Good.
Yes.
So this right. I can attribute to Ryan, who is an amazing colleague of mine, who did a lot of design and implementation work on this, and he had this idea, and everyone was like, if it's hard, don't do it. But it's just such a small, cute little Easter egg that some people recognize and find out about it and ask on Twitter, and some people don't. But that's a small little thing. There's a couple of things inside the Forecast that we were able to do, even being under time constraints that we were under. But yeah, no, I mean, I could go on about all of the things that I learned, but I think it's good. I'm also looking forward to a non-election year, to be honest.
I can imagine. Yeah. And I guess the bigger picture, and you've talked about the things that you have done and things that you may not have done, ideas that you had. I guess they'll always have a value going forward with other projects. Even if it's not necessarily the same topic, the design concept, the technique will always be something that's relevant to any of the data-driven topics that you as a organization cover. So it sounds like a terrific experience. I'm going to leave you now because you've got a busy week, I have no doubt. In fact, could be weeks, months, who knows. But that's been fascinating. Thank you ever so much for going through that.
Thank you.
Learned so much. But yeah, thank you to you, Anna. Thank you to all listeners and viewers, and see you again soon for another episode of Explore Explain.
To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.